First off, before I start gushing about this movie, because trust me, it's a must-watch, I just want to say how much I hate the title. I mean, Connected or Disconnected, or however you were supposed to say it, wasn't exactly the best title for an animated film I've ever heard, and that's coming from the guy who called his first cartoon Vitality. Connected is admittedly not a great title, but it is vastly superior to The Mitchells versus the Machines. I think what most likely happened here is Sony didn't see enough of a social media response from their first trailer that they wanted, and someone somewhere decided that renaming the film would be a good way to boost word-of-mouth marketing for the film, and to a certain extent they were right. It would have been much easier to market the film with a better title, but instead of doing that, they chose a worse title. It's interesting because I don't think your average person realizes that the title of a theatrical film is actually not something that the director or creator of the film has any control over. There's plenty of examples of directors having their films renamed before release, or directors in big franchises who don't even have the slightest clue of what their film will be called while they're in the middle of directing it. And as an artist, I really feel that struggle because the title of a piece of art is itself a part of the art. This illustration is the perfect example of this because the image itself says, "This is not a pipe," which could be taken to many various interpretations, but when you take that phrase into consideration with the title of the piece, The Treachery of Images, which is not written on the piece itself, but instead exists outside the illustration, then you get a clearer understanding of what the artist is trying to say. The Treachery of Images. It's not a complex idea. A drawing of a pipe is not the same thing as a pipe. When we choose to engage with art, it's very common that our eyes trick us into believing what we're seeing. The more realistic or detailed or accurate an image, the more likely we are to believe it. The treachery of images is even more applicable today in the era of film and television because while we think that a film shows us something alive and breathing, we are actually just watching still images one after the other, and yet we interpret that as something moving. The illusion of motion in film is a perfect analog to the message behind the treachery of images, and the treachery of images is the perfect teaching tool for the importance of what your artwork is titled and how it affects your audience's engagement with it. I could probably do a whole video about the evolution of titles in the world of short YouTube content and how with a completely new title on the same video you can convince more people to watch and engage with your video. College Humor has more or less mastered this technique to the point where they don't even have to make good or clever videos anymore. They just have to write a title that people will click on and they basically get to watch the money roll in. They've blazed the trail for most corporate YouTube content now, and you can see in the past 5 or 6 years that YouTube channels run by Comedy Central and SNL have basically been following in their footsteps. Long story short, titles matter, and I think renaming this film from Connected to The Mitchells versus the Machines was a step in the wrong direction. But it's a fantastic film. I had a great time watching it. Now, it's not quite as good as Spider-Verse, which I hate saying because personally I think it's stupid to give ratings or rankings to art, which is by definition subjective in nature. While I was watching the first half of this movie, I was thinking to myself, wow, despite all the similarities, this film is actually very different from Spider-Verse and shouldn't be compared to it. But then during the second half, I found some of the emotional beats to be slightly more contrived. For instance, while the characters are disguised and infiltrating the villain's headquarters, seen that one before, the villain decides to show everybody on every screen footage of the main characters lying to each other earlier in the film. And it's just like, I know we need this scene at this point in the movie. It's like the complication in the final act, which makes it seem like all hope might be lost, but it just doesn't feel like it makes sense in the story itself. Now, tone is a huge factor in every film, and normally a film like this with a goofy tone can get away with more contrived plot points, but when you compare it to Spider-Verse or even the Lego Movie, which both manage their goofy tone while also flawlessly using the rules of the story to introduce that last little complication that separates our characters before they can come back together again in the finale of the film, it just makes Mitchells vs. the Machines look a little bit more bland in comparison. The reason that Spider-Verse's scene works better is because the characters make the decision to leave Miles behind on their own with no interference from the villains, and that just makes it hurt so much more to watch all the spider people abandon him. It's just much more powerful when it comes from the characters themselves. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. In Mitchells vs. the Machines, they technically are watching footage of themselves earlier in the film, but the circumstances under which they're shown the footage just isn't the best. I just think it would have been better to have Aaron Mitchell, the younger brother, reveal that information to the group, either accidentally or better yet on purpose because he's losing confidence in his family. I just think that would have been more impactful. Not to get into the business of telling people how to fix their movies, but hey, I just did. There's a handful of other aspects in the second half that could have been improved, but I won't go into that point by point. Suffice it to say, it just didn't feel quite as natural as Spider-Verse. Now don't get me wrong, Spider-Verse has some contrivances too. For example, I had problems with Miles Morales' dad being the only cop who witnessed the final showdown between Spider-Man and Kingpin, and then he receives a hug from Spider-Man at the end of the film and somehow doesn't recognize that that's his son. Personally, I think it would have been better to use the Spider-Man Homecoming approach where the film ends with the parental figure discovering their child's secret alias. But since Spider-Man Homecoming was released only a year and a half earlier, it was probably decided by the corporate executives that Spider-Verse couldn't use a similar ending because that would feel like a copycat. Boy golly, I sure do love how corporations make decisions based on marketability and not based on what actually works for the story. Mitchells vs. the Machines has a very similar ending to Spider-Verse, with the slight improvement that Katie and her dad, the relationship which the entire film hinges on, get to team up in the end. In Spider-Verse, Miles Morales teams up with the other Spider-Men to defeat the villain, leaving his dad on the sidelines to witness the final battle but not participate. In Mitchells vs. the Machines, Katie and her dad actually fight together alongside their other family members, and that's just great. However, besides that one small improvement, the film does take a lot of its DNA from Spider-Verse, as well as the amazing world of Gumball, right down to its use of photographic imagery alongside abstract cartoonish styles of drawings to create a sort of handmade pastiche aesthetic. The movie also borrows some of its comedic stylings from this show as well, and you can feel it in the pacing of the way that some of the jokes are edited, as well as in the timing of the animation itself. The primary difference between this movie and the show being budget, because while Gumball does have great animation from time to time, it is a television show constricted by lower budgets and shorter deadlines. Mitchells vs. the Machines, on the other hand, has some of the most inventive and fluid animation ever. Look at the way these characters flow across the screen, the brilliant timing of every action beat. It manages to guide your eye across the screen with multiple points of focus across the frame without ever becoming so noisy that your eye gets lost. The animators put so much effort into ensuring that the motion was easy to understand, even when it bounces across from left to right to up to down. Simply put, if you're an animator, you'll recognize the extreme effort and talent that was poured into this film. And if you're not an animator, and for some reason you don't see how this film stands a cut above the rest, then just trust me. This film is mind-blowing just as much as Spider-Verse was. Now, it's not a perfect film, and there's lots to criticize. There's also lots of great things in the film I could touch on, from heartfelt emotional beats to subtle background gags, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the presence of something which has irked me ever since the film was called Connected and the first trailer came out. There is a technique in this film where they incorporate smaller, cartoonish drawings into an otherwise detailed and more realistic 3D rendered frame. Take, for example, this and this. Now, I don't want to get all tinfoil hat here, and I generally like the films that Netflix produces. But Netflix isn't exactly the bastion of creative independence that everyone, especially outsiders, might think that it is. With their growth in the last decade, they have become just like every other corporation, relying on their reputation as a brand who supports independent filmmakers and providing a voice for them, while in actuality they are taking advantage of those creators. I recently saw a TikTok from the director of a short film who teamed up with Now This to get her film more broadly marketed online a few years ago. Now, a few weeks ago, a short film from Netflix won an Oscar, and it was heavily inspired by the short film directed by the woman in the TikTok. Unfortunately, the woman in question, Cynthia Cao, was not consulted in this, and did not receive any compensation, nor did she give permission for Now This or Netflix to use her idea. While it might not be an issue that she could win in a copyright lawsuit, it's easy to see Netflix's predatory behavior, as well as Now This. At the very least, one of these two companies should have offered financial compensation to Cao, but more appropriately, they should have given her a position on the creative team that directed this film. Now, what does this have to do with Mitchells vs. the Machines? Well, another indie creator, Joni Phillips, has built up a reputation for making weird animations online. Her style didn't exactly evolve from nowhere, and if you look at her work, you can clearly see the inspiration from more exaggerated and less rigid cartoon styles from Sunday morning papers dating all the way back to the invention of the newspaper. But the style here, the extreme size difference between the drawings, the ultra-extreme shape and pose of the characters, all the crazy inventive stuff that she does, it's not exactly commonplace in animation these days, even in student films and experimental films. Joni has built a reputation and a following around this style, and it's undeniably hers. So when you watch The Mitchells vs. the Machines, you see a similar style, a style that is non-existent in mainstream animation and really not even common in indie animation, and you immediately think of Joni's work. But here's the problem. Netflix didn't consult Joni for this, nor did they offer her any financial compensation for aping her style. Now again, Netflix is not under any legal obligation to do this. It's just kind of shitty. But it falls in line with the history of big corporations taking advantage of the creativity and ingenuity of independent creators and then leaving them out to dry financially. I will admit, after I saw this tweet from Joni last year, after the trailer was released and it was immediately obvious that Netflix copied her style, I was hesitant to engage with the film at all. Of course, I did engage with the film, and I'm ultimately glad that I did. It's a great movie. I just wish the creative team and the artists behind this film did their due diligence with respect to the artists they clearly took inspiration from. So that sucks. I expect better from whom I consider to be some of my favorite artists in the industry. Lord and Miller just turn everything they touch to gold. Michael Rianda and Jeff Rowe were part of the legendary team behind the greatest TV show of all time. And it might sound like I'm offering nothing but criticism for a film that I claim to have liked, but we should always be critical of the things we like. It's easy to dunk on something we hate without feeling too bad, but it's important to be critical of the things we love. I could talk for days on end about things I don't like in Gravity Falls, or Better Call Saul, or Spider-Verse, and same with this film. This film has an amazing score by Mark Mothersbaugh, and there's some great music choices throughout the film, but they also decided to go with the meme song from 15 years ago during the climactic battle. I mean, this song hasn't been relevant since before most kids these days were born, and adults haven't thought about this song in 10 years, so who is this music choice for? Spider-Verse at least managed not to use any meme music for its pop music choices. In 5 years, we'll look a lot more fondly at the soundtrack for Spider-Verse than we will for Mitchells and the Machines. So yeah, overall, I loved the film. There's some stuff worth criticizing, and I think that's all I have to say about it. Check out our Patreon if you want to support us, and look forward to my cartoon coming out later this year.